What if the greatest monument of the ancient world began not in stone, but in mud? Before cities claimed the horizon, more than 4,000 years ago, there was the mud. Here, the two great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, lost themselves in one another. Coolness rose from the black water in visible tendrils, a ground-hugging mist that carried the scent of the place. The air was heavy with it, a palpable humidity that settled on the skin like a second, cooler layer. Sound here was sparse and liquid. The occasional plop of a turtle slipping from a bank, the rustle of a water bird stirring in its nest of woven stems. But the fundamental truth, the bedrock of this landscape, was underfoot. The mud, it was everywhere. It was the black, oozing slurry at the water's edge, cold and greedy, ready to swallow a foothold with a soft, sucking gasp. It was the product of a silent, relentless work conducted over millennia. The rivers, unseen giants to the north, carried the mountains down grain by grain. Here, where their currents slackened and spread, they released their burden. Particles of silt, finer than dust, drifted down through the slow water, settling in layers so thin they were imperceptible. Layer upon layer, season upon season, flood upon flood. This was how the land was built. As the sun finally cleared the distant plain, turning the sky to gold and then to a pale, watery blue, the true color of the mud emerged. The city, when it appeared on the horizon, would be a thing made from this baked, shaped, and stacked. From the formless fecundity of the marshes, geometry emerged. Human will from around 3,000 years ago had imposed a stark and angular order upon the alluvial plain. The canals were cuts in the flesh of the land, precise incisions draining lifeblood from the rivers and directing it with slow, deliberate purpose. They were the arteries of the city-state, a network of engineered waterways etched into the madbar, the silt plain. Viewed from a height, they formed a rigid grid, a counterpoint to the river's natural curves. Primary channels broad enough for two reed boats to pass ran straight as stretched cords toward the horizon. From these, smaller capillaries branched at perfect right angles, subdividing the land into rectangular plots of emerald barley and pale sesame. The water within these conduits moved with a different character than the river's flow. It was sluggish, thick with suspended silt, a deliberate ooze rather than a current. It did not sparkle like marsh water. It was the color of dull lead, its surface streaked with wind-blown dust and floating mats of green algae. The confining walls of the canals were not natural banks. They were built things, made of the same mud they channeled, transformed by labor and sun. Layers of packed silt reinforced with courses of mud brick rose in steep artificial levees. Their surfaces were a testament to constant vigilance. They were cross-hatched with the cracks of desiccation, a network of deep polygonal fissures that widened under the relentless sun. The smell here was distinct from the wet decay of the marshes. It was the smell of earth baking. A hot mineral scent rose from the cracked mud, carrying the faint, bitter tang of evaporated salts, the ever-present enemy, leaching upward to poison the soil. Maintenance was the silent, perpetual ritual of this landscape. At a canal's edge, the tools of this battle lay scattered. A discarded reed mat, its bindings frayed, its surface caked in dried mud, spoke of a recent repair to the levee's face. A worn wooden shovel, its blades smoothed by countless grains of silt, stood propped against the bank. The sensory experience was one of dry heat and particulate air. The oppressive midday heat shimmered above the water's surface, creating a wavering mirage that dissolved the far bank into liquid light. Dust, raised from the parched levee by a passing breeze, hung in the still air, gilding the sunlight and coating the throat. The canals were monuments not to a moment, but to continuity. Their geometric precision was an illusion maintained daily. The silt they carried was both blessing and curse, fertility deposited on flooded fields, but also sediment that settled and shallowed the channel itself, requiring seasonal dredging. A length of rope, frayed and sun-bleached, lay coiled near a measured stake, a tool for determining the proper slope and depth. Every element spoke of calculation, of a deep, empirical understanding of water and earth. Here, the mud was no longer a primordial soup. It was a construction material, quarried, shaped, and dried. It was the mortar that held the bricks of civilization together. The water it carried was not free, but allocated, measured, and controlled. This landscape was a hybrid, a creation of the mind made manifest in earth and water. The canals were silent, flowing lines of intent, the written language of survival etched directly into the skin of the plain, a constant slow-motion battle fought with shovels, reeds, and human patience against the twin specters of drought and salt. The city's heart was a mountain of mud. Before the first human sounds, before the scent of baking bread or the clatter of looms, there was only its silhouette against the paling eastern sky, a colossal, stepped form that seemed less built than grown, a tectonic upheaval of human will made solid. From the low, sleeping city, it dominated everything. Its shadow, in the final moments of night, was a vast, cool stain stretching westward across the maze of flat-roofed dwellings, swallowing whole districts in its geometric darkness. The structure was a ziggurat, a solid mass of sun-dried brick rising in 3 receding tiers. It was not a hollow temple, but an artificial hill, a ramp of earth and clay built to elevate the sacred above the profane. Its profile was a stark series of horizontal lines against the vertical dawn, each terrace a cliff face, each staircase a deep shadowed incision. As the light grew, the texture of the mountain revealed itself. The bricks were the color of the plain itself, the pale, dusty gray of dried river silt. They were not uniform. Some bore the rough imprint of the wooden molds that shaped them, their edges softened by centuries of wind and infrequent, gentle rain. Others showed the subtle, woven pattern of the straw binder mixed into the clay to prevent cracking, a fossilized memory of chaff and stalk. The surfaces were pitted and scarred, eroded in places into shallow grooves where water had found a purchase and frozen, expanding and contracting with the seasons. This was not the smooth, carved stone of later ages. This was architecture of the earth, compacted and baked only by the sun, perpetually crumbling and being repaired, a living skin of clay. The first direct light of the sun struck the highest terrace. It was a precise, almost violent event. One moment, the topmost platform was a featureless slab of gray, crowned by the small, dark block of the temple shrine, the cella. The next, a razor line of fire traced across its eastern edge. The light did not warm so much as gild. It transformed the dull brick into a surface of pale, luminous gold, making the straw inclusions glitter like flecks of mica. The transformation crept downward, inch by inch, as the sun cleared the distant rim of the world. The upper terrace now floated, detached, a platform of light above the still-shadowed bulk below. This contrast defined the moment. The ziggurat was two entities at once. Its peak belonged to the sky, to the realm of the god who was believed to descend there. It was clean, sharp, and radiant. The rest of the structure, still drowned in blue shadow, belonged to the earth. It was heavy, silent, and immense. The long, steep staircases that climbed its flanks were tunnels of darkness, their steps not yet visible, leading from the human city into the realm of light above. From this vantage, the city itself seemed inconsequential, a low, sprawling disorder of brown and gray. The neat geometry of the canals was invisible from here. Only the haphazard jumble of domestic architecture was apparent, a beehive of mud-plastered reed and mud brick built in the mountain's literal shadow. Thin plumes of smoke from overnight hearths began to rise from a few compounds, the first signs of waking life, but they were frail and dissipating against the monumental stillness of the temple complex. The great outer walls of the precinct formed a clear boundary, a sacred rectangle enclosing the ziggurat and its ancillary buildings. Storehouses, workshops, administrative quarters, separating the ordered world of the gods and their servants from the organic chaos of the people. The air at this hour was perfectly still and cool, carrying the night's chill from the bricks. There was no sound but the first tentative calls of swifts nesting in the ziggurat's countless cracks and crevices. The structure exerted a silent pressure, a gravitational pull on the eye and the mind. It was the axis of the world. Every canal aligned with it, every street in the lower town eventually led toward it. Every measure of grain in the storehouses below was accounted for in its name. It was the ultimate expression of the mud from which it rose, the marsh silt, dredged, molded, dried, and stacked into a testament of collective labor and divine aspiration. As the sun climbed, the line of gold descended. It flowed down the second terrace, then the first, slowly burning away the shadow. The mountain was waking. The golden light revealed the subtle variations in brickwork, the repairs made over generations, the patches of newer, darker clay against the older, bleached surfaces. It revealed the subtle inward slope of the walls, engineered for stability, making the structure seem even more massive, more rooted. By the time the full sun bathed the entire eastern face, the ziggurat was no longer a mysterious silhouette. It was a fact. A mountain of mud brick, glowing in the morning heat, an anchor of permanence in the river plain, its highest point a beacon visible for hours in all directions, declaring that here, humanity had not only settled the mud, but had piled it to the heavens. The monumental silence of the ziggurat gave way to a smaller, more intimate stillness. Within the low, sprawling city, beneath roofs of bundled reeds and walls of mud-plastered stalks, the night's coolness lingered, pooled and preserved. The interior of a typical dwelling was a cave carved from daylight, a dim sanctuary shaped by necessity from the land's most abundant materials. Entry was through a low doorway, a gap in the wall covered by a woven reed mat now pushed aside. The space within was not large, perhaps 4 paces by 6, and the ceiling was low enough that a tall man would feel its dried, thatched underside brush his hair. The air was several degrees cooler than the brightening world outside, and carried a complex, settled scent. It was the smell of the earth itself, the dry, clean odor of sun-baked mud plaster, undercut by the faint, sweet grassiness of the reeds that formed the home's skeleton. Beneath that lay older, subtler notes. The ghost of yesterday's bread, the oily aroma of crushed sesame from a lamp long extinguished, the mineral tang of the packed earth floor. Light entered cautiously in defined shafts and slivers. Small, high openings, set just below the roofline for security and temperature control, admitted the morning sun. These beams cut through the dimness like pale blades, illuminating swirling galaxies of dust motes. They fell in precise, bright rectangles upon the floor, or striped the opposite wall with bars of gold, revealing the texture of the plaster in sharp relief, the rough imprint of the hand that had applied it, the subtle ridges left by the stalks beneath. Where the light did not reach, the corners of the room remained in deep, velvety shadow, giving the space a feeling of soft enclosure. The floor was the plane's own skin, tamped hard by generations of bare feet. It was cool to the touch, a solid, unyielding coolness that seeped upward. In the center of the room lay a single large woven reed mat, its pattern a simple checkerboard of lighter and darker stems, worn smooth and glossy in the places where bodies habitually sat or slept. This mat was the room's sole concession to ornamentation, its geometry the only echo of the city's larger monumental order. Against one wall sat a low, wide-mouthed ceramic jar, its surface the color of terracotta, stained dark around the rim from repeated handling. This was the grain bin, its contents a modest store of barley, hidden beneath a fitted lid of baked clay. Beside it rested two smaller pots, one for water, its surface beaded with condensation, the other for dried legumes. They were functional, undecorated, their forms dictated by the potter's wheel and the kiln's heat. The room's heart was its hearth, a shallow, circular depression in the floor near the wall opposite the door, lined with cracked mud baked black and hard by countless fires. Now it was cold and silent. A fine, powdery ash, pale as bone dust, filled its bowl perfectly still. A few fragments of charcoal, like shattered bits of night, lay half buried in the ash. A simple tripod of fired clay used to support a cooking pot stood beside it, a silent sentinel. This cold hearth was a promise of evening, of warmth and smell and the transformation of grain into food. But for now it was merely another artifact of stillness. The atmosphere was one of profound, palpable quiet. It was a different silence than that of the marshes or the pre-dawn ziggurat. This was a domestic silence, thick with the residue of sleep and the anticipation of the day's labor. The coolness was not the damp chill of the wetlands, but a dry, retained coolness, the night's gift held captive by thick walls and a lack of window. It was a space of shelter, not ceremony, of family, not institution. Objects here spoke of anonymous, collective life. A worn wooden spindle lay near the mat, a few wisps of wool still clinging to it. A pair of simple leather sandals sat neatly by the door. A basketry tray, its weave tight and skilled, awaited the day's grinding of grain. There were no personal marks, no individual signatures. Each item was typical, replaceable, a component in the unchanging cycle of domestic survival. As the sun outside climbed higher, the angles of the light shafts through the high openings steepened, their bright rectangles sliding slowly across the floor, inching toward the cold hearth. The illuminated dust motes danced more vigorously. The coolness in the air began to thin, warmed at its edges by the penetrating sun. The room was slowly waking, not with sound, but with a gradual shift in temperature and light. Soon the mat would be rolled, the grain measured, the hearth stirred to life. But for this suspended moment, the interior of the Reed home was a perfect, silent vessel, holding the last of the night, a private, human-scaled counterpoint to the vast, engineered landscapes of canal and temple outside its walls. The city's lifeblood was stored in silence. Adjacent to the ziggurat's sacred precinct, within the high, windowless walls of the temple complex, lay a series of vast, cavernous rooms that held the physical proof of the gods and the state's bounty. This was the granary, the silent engine of survival, a monument not to the heavens, but to earthly accumulation. The air within was thick, still, and laden with scent. The dominant note was the smell of stored barley, a dry, sweet, dusty aroma that filled the space like an invisible fog. It was the smell of stability, of full measure, a tangible promise against the specter of hunger. This primary scent was so pervasive it seemed to coat the tongue and the back of the throat. But beneath it, other odors threaded through the stillness. A faint, sour tang of fermented beer seeped from the seals of certain large jars. The pungent, briny scent of dried fish, bundled and stacked, cut through the grain dust. There was the dry, papery smell of old reed, and the cool, mineral odor of sun-baked clay. The air did not move. It simply hung, stratified, a library of smells cataloging the city's sustenance. The scale of the space imposed a hushed reverence. The ceilings, supported by massive columns of mud brick, vanished into shadow high above. The walls, lined from floor to unseen ceiling with orderly ranks of storage vessels, seemed to recede into infinity in the dim light that filtered from small, high ventilation slits. The vessels themselves were an army of containment. There were large, bulbous pottery jars, taller than a man, their shoulders broad and their mouths sealed with cloth and clay. Their surfaces were unglazed, the color of the earth from which they were fired, stained in places from the seepage of oils or beer. Alongside them stood stacks of woven reed baskets, their sides reinforced with bitumen to make them watertight, their lids tied down with cords of twisted fiber. The floor was swept clean, a surface of hard-packed earth worn smooth by the passage of countless sandaled feet. It was marked only by the faint, circular impressions where the great jars sat, and by the geometric shadows cast by the vessels in the slanted light. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional minute settling of grain within a jar, a soft, whispering sigh, or the faint creak of a reed basket adjusting to the weight of its contents. This was not the quiet of absence, but of immense sleeping potential. Every jar, every basket was a closed parenthesis around a portion of the harvest held in trust. Order was the granary's true architecture. Along one wall away from the towering jars ran a series of low mud brick shelves. Upon these rested the clay tablets that governed this silent wealth. They were stacked in neat piles, each tablet a flat, pillow-shaped rectangle of damp clay, now dried to a permanent hardness. Their surfaces, even from a distance, showed the uniform, angular impressions of cuneiform script, not words of poetry or prayer, but meticulous records of quantity, origin, and allocation. These tablets were the shadows of the jars, the intangible double of the physical stores, a bureaucracy rendered in miniature. The final seal of this order was visible on the great wooden doors that led to individual storage chambers. These doors were not merely closed, they were secured with complex clay ceilings. Cords were wound around the door's bar and latch, then encased in a lump of wet clay. Into this soft clay, a cylinder seal, a small carved stone tube owned by a temple official, was rolled with firm pressure. The result was a clay bulla, a hardened lump bearing an intricate miniature scene, perhaps a contest of heroes, a presentation to a deity, or a pattern of interlocking animals. This impression was a signature, a legal and divine safeguard. To break the seal was to break a covenant, to violate the order that kept the grain safe and accounted for. These bullae, with their sharp, detailed impressions, were scattered on shelves or in small baskets near the doors, a collection of administrative fingerprints. The atmosphere was one of profound, weighted calm. The cool, dense air, the towering shadows, the sheer mass of stored food created a feeling of subterranean security. This was the belly of the city-state, the reservoir from which all labor was rewarded, all offices provisioned. The granary translated the chaotic fertility of the irrigated fields, the work of sun, water, and peasant farmers, into a static, measurable, and controllable resource. The mud of the plain had been transformed first into grain, and now into silent, geometric rows of sealed pottery. Light, entering from the high vents, fell in narrow, brilliant shafts that cut through the dusty gloom. These beams illuminated floating motes of barley dust, turning them into drifting constellations. They caught the rough lip of a storage jar, the tight weave of a basket, the sharp edge of a clay tablet, making these objects gleam momentarily before leaving them again in shadow. In these slants of light, the scale of the accumulation became awe-inspiring. The granary was a man-made ecology of surplus, a triumph of organization over nature's unpredictability. It stood as a silent testament to the temple's power, the power to gather, to count, to store, and to withhold. The scent of barley and dust was the scent of that power, dry, ancient, and absolute. In a small, quiet room adjacent to the granary's silent wealth, the act of accounting became a physical event. The air here was cooler, damper, carrying the clean mineral scent of wet clay from a nearby preparation basin. A single shaft of morning light, entering through a high, narrow window, fell upon a scribal bench, a simple, waist-high table of mud brick plastered smooth. Upon this surface lay the object of focus, a single, damp clay tablet, its edges soft, its surface the color of dark honey. The tablet was a rectangle, slightly convex, designed to fit comfortably in the palm of one hand. It had been formed not long before. The clay had been dug from a pure deposit near the river, free of pebbles and organic matter, then kneaded and wedged with water to a perfect plastic consistency. A lump of this material had been rolled and patted into this form, its dimensions standardized, its surfaces smoothed with a damp piece of leather until they were almost glossy. It was cool to the touch, a dense, yielding coolness that held the memory of the riverbank. Beside the tablet lay the tool of its transformation, a reed stylus. It was a short length of marsh reed, one end cut on a sharp diagonal to create a wedge-shaped tip. The reed was smooth, polished by use, its hollow interior dry and light. This stylus was not a pen, it was a stamp, a chisel, a blunt instrument of pressure. The process began without ceremony. A hand, impersonal, practiced, took up the stylus. The tablet was cradled in the other palm, tilted slightly toward the light. The first impression was made not at the top, but near the upper left corner. The stylus was held at a consistent angle, approximately 45 degrees to the surface. Its sharp, wedge-shaped corner was pressed straight down into the soft clay, then lifted cleanly away. The result was not a line, but a depression, a neat triangular pit, deeper at the head where the corner bit, shallowing to a faint ridge at its tail. This was the basic wedge, the foundational mark of cuneiform. The action was rhythmic, a series of precise, separate pressures. The stylus was not dragged. It was impressed, then repositioned, to form a sign representing a number, the symbol for 30, a cluster of 3 circular impressions made with the stylus's rounded end. The hand rotated the tool deftly, its movements economical and sure. To create the sign for barley, a combination of wedges arranged in a specific, learned pattern. The stylus angled and pressed, each impact a soft, definitive thup that was felt through the palm holding the tablet. The sensory experience was profoundly tactile. The clay yielded to the stylus with a slight resistance, a muted give that traveled up the scribe's fingers. The stylus itself was smooth and dry against the skin. The primary sound was this quiet, percussive pressing and the faint, wet scrape as the stylus was occasionally wiped clean on a damp cloth to prevent accumulating clay from blurring the next impression. There was no scratch of ink, no whisper of a brush. This was writing as a form of low-relief sculpture, a subtraction of material. As the work progressed, the visual result emerged from the blank surface. Orderly, horizontal rows of signs took shape, reading from left to right. Each row was perfectly aligned, the signs spaced with uniform regularity. The impressions were clean-edged, sharp, and deep enough to survive the tablet's drying and hardening. The signs themselves were a mix, groups of wedges forming abstracted pictures of commodities, a jar, a fish, a human head in profile for ration, interspersed with the simpler repeated wedges and circles denoting numerals. This was not literature or legend, it was a ledger entry. A record of so many gur of barley received from the fields of the northern district, so many jars of oil from the temple workshops, so many baskets of dried fish from the river catch. The light from the high window played across the growing text. It caught the angled facets of the wedge impressions, creating tiny, sharp shadows on one side of each depression, leaving the opposite slope in bright highlight. This gave the surface a textured, shimmering quality, a landscape of minute valleys and ridges. The damp clay glistened where it was freshly exposed, darkening until it matched the older impressions as the moisture evaporated. The tablet was a node in a vast, silent system. Its creation in this quiet room was the final tangible step in a chain that began with the sowing of seed in the irrigated plots, passed through the hands of harvesters, measurers, and storers, and now culminated in this physical act of documentation. Once the final sign was impressed, the tablet would be set aside on a shelf to dry slowly in the shade, hardening into a permanent record. It might later be encased in a clay envelope and sealed, its contents hidden and protected, or stored in a basket with dozens of its kind, a stack of bureaucratic fossils. The atmosphere was one of concentrated calm. The cool, damp air, the rhythmic, deliberate pressure of stylus on clay, the focused attention on the emerging pattern, all combined to create a bubble of silent productivity. This was the point where the physical world of grain, fish, and oil was translated into the abstract world of information and control. The reed stylus was the pivot between these realms. With each thup, a portion of the city's sustenance was accounted for, removed from the realm of nature and entered into the ledger of the state. When the recording was complete, the scribe's hand set the stylus down. The tablet lay on the bench, transformed. Its surface, once smooth and featureless, now bore the indelible, orderly script of administration. The wedges and circles, precise and silent, would outlast the season's barley, the fermented beer, the very mud brick walls of the room. They were a different kind of architecture, not a mountain of brick, but a miniature landscape of meaning, built from countless careful impressions in a rectangle of river clay. The damp tablet gleamed in the slanted light, a cool, heavy token of order, its cuneiform indentations holding the shape of numbers and things, a permanent whisper of quantity in the quiet room. The city's sustenance was not a static store, but a constant, fragrant alchemy. In the shadow of the silent granary, a different kind of temple precinct hummed with transformation. Here, the measured commodities of barley, dates and fish underwent their ordained changes, processed by heat, fermentation, and air into the forms destined for consumption. This was the realm of preparation, a landscape of smoke, steam, and pervasive odor where the bureaucracy of grain became the chemistry of food. The first sign from a distance was the smoke. Not the thin, blue wisps from domestic hearths, but thick, creamy plumes that rose in steady columns from low, beehive-shaped ovens of mud brick. These ovens stood in open courtyards, their domed tops blackened by soot, their mouths glowing with the orange heart of a barley straw fire. The smoke carried the first defining scent, the rich, nutty aroma of baking barley bread. It was a smell both simple and profound, the smell of starch transforming into sustenance, of dough blistering and browning on the hot interior walls of the ovens. The smoke itself had a sweet, almost malty taste on the air. Closer, the sensory barrage intensified. Adjacent to the oven yards stood long, shaded sheds open to the breeze. Within these, on elevated racks of lashed reeds, lay hundreds of silvery fish, split open and splayed like wings. They dried in the sun and the constant dusty wind, their skins hardening to a leathery texture, their flesh curing to a dense, salty concentrate. The smell here was briny and sharp, the smell of the river concentrated and preserved, undercut by the faint metallic scent of blood long dried. Flies buzzed in lazy clouds, repelled by occasional waves of smoke from smoldering herbs, adding a bitter herbal note to the air. But the true olfactory symphony came from the temple kitchens themselves, large vaulted rooms where the heat was a physical presence. Great clay vats, taller than a man and wide as a chariot wheel, stood in rows, their contents bubbling with a slow, gaseous languor. These were the beer vats where a mash of barley bread was fermenting in water. The smell was pungent, yeasty, and slightly sour, a humid exhalation that clung to the walls and the roof reeds. It mingled inextricably with other cooking smells, the sweet caramel scent of dates simmering into syrup in wide, shallow pans, the earthy, pungent aroma of onions and leeks sweating in oil over smaller fires, the sharp tang of garlic and coriander seeds being crushed on stone slabs. The soundscape was a low, industrial murmur. The dominant noise was the hiss and crackle of fires, fed continuously by attendants with armfuls of straw and dried dung. Beneath this was the rhythmic slap of wet dough being shaped into flat rounds before being slapped onto the oven walls. There was the gurgle of the fermenting vats, a subterranean sound of slow digestion. The scrape of wooden paddles stirring thick porridge in copper cauldrons added a metallic scraping counterpoint. Voices were rare and functional, brief calls for more fuel or water, absorbed instantly by the heat and the dense, fragrant air. The logistics of the operation were visible in the orderly flow of materials. At one end of a kitchen, a steady stream of porters arrived, their shoulders bent under sacks of grain just released from the granary. These were dumped into stone querns where kneeling workers, their movements rhythmic and endless, ground the barley into coarse flour with handheld grinding stones, the sound a continuous grating crush. The flour was gathered into baskets, which were carried to the dough makers. Elsewhere, boys hauled baskets of fresh dates from the storerooms, their sticky sweetness already attracting a haze of wasps. Great clay amphorae of water, brought from the canal on shoulder poles, stood in rows, waiting to be decanted. The outflow was equally systematic. From the ovens, attendants used long wooden peels to retrieve the finished loaves flat, round discs with charred, bubbled surfaces. These were stacked in towering, precarious piles on large platters, then carried swiftly away on the heads of servers, bound for the redistribution hall or the precincts of the temple officials. From the beer vats, the fermented liquid was siphoned through ceramic tubes into smaller sealed jars, their lids tied down with cord. The dried fish, now light and hard, were gathered into bundles, tied with reeds, and stacked like cordwood on reed mats for transport. Nothing was wasted. The spent grain from beer making was collected for animal feed. Fish heads and entrails went into secondary broths or fertilizer. Even the wood ash from the ovens was swept up to be used in cleaning or in brick making. The entire complex was a closed circuit of transformation, a physical manifestation of the temple's role as converter and distributor. The raw, anonymous bounty of the land entered these spaces. Standardized, prepared commodities emerged. The heat in the kitchen rooms was immense. A dry, radiating heat from the ovens, and a wet, steaming heat from the vats and cauldrons. It drew sweat that evaporated almost instantly in the arid air, leaving a salty grit on the skin. The light was dim and smoky, shafts of sunlight from high vents cutting through a haze of steam and flour dust, illuminating the swirling vapors like solid things. Workers moved through this haze like shadows, their actions practiced to the point of ritual, their faces glistening. This was the engine of daily survival, running on a fuel of grain and fire. The smokes of preparation were the city's exhalation, the visible sign of its metabolism. The mingled smells of baking bread, fermenting beer, drying fish, and cooking vegetables formed a single complex perfume that hung over the temple quarter, a constant olfactory reminder of the system at work. It was the smell of order imposed upon nature, of plenty being actively manufactured from the raw materials of the plain, a fragrant, steaming testament to the relentless daily alchemy that turned mud-born barley into the stuff of life. Between the fragrant chaos of preparation and the silent accumulation of the granary lay the space of allocation. The redistribution hall was not a place of transformation, but of presentation, not a workshop, but a stage. It was the architectural expression of the temple economy made visible, a long, columned chamber where the system paused, holding its breath in perfect anticipatory order. The hall was a canyon of shadow and geometric light, two parallel rows of thick mud brick columns, their surfaces plastered smooth and painted with faded bands of red ochre, marched the length of the space, supporting a high roof of cedar beams and packed earth. The floor was a vast expanse of clean-swept, tamped earth, hard as stone and pale with the dust of its own sweeping. It was empty of all but the arrangements placed upon it, a stage awaiting its actors. Light entered from a clerestory, a high row of small, square openings set just below the roofline along both long walls. The morning sun slanted through these apertures in sharp, brilliant shafts, cutting through the cool, still air to strike the floor in precise rectangles of gold. These luminous patches lay at regular intervals, like stepping stones of light, between which lay pools of deep, soft shadow. The columns themselves were half in light, half in darkness, their curved surfaces rendered in stark chiaroscuro, amplifying their monumental scale. The air was cool, dry, and utterly still, carrying only the faint mineral scent of dried clay and the ghost of old straw. Upon this vast, empty floor, the allocations were laid out. They were not piled or heaped, but arranged with a precision that bordered on the ritualistic. At measured intervals, exactly 10 paces apart, sat identical woven reed mats. Each mat was a perfect square, its edges aligned with the invisible grid of the hall's architecture. Upon each mat sat a group of vessels, a complete daily ration for a household or a work gang, placed with symmetrical care. The composition was always the same. In the center stood a medium-sized pottery jar, its mouth sealed with a cloth and a dab of clay. This contained the barley beer, dark and slightly sour. To its left sat 2 round, flat loaves of barley bread, stacked, their surfaces blistered from the oven, their edges perfectly aligned. To the right of the jar lay a bundle of dried fish, 3 in number, tied with a single twist of reed, their silvery, desiccated forms arranged parallel to one another. Beside the fish was a small clay bowl holding a measure of dried dates, their wrinkled skins glowing like amber in a slat of sunlight. Finally, at the front of the mat, a neat pile of fresh onions, their papery skins still dusty from the earth, completed the set. There were dozens of these arrangements, perhaps 100, receding in perfect ranks into the hall's dim depths. The repetition was hypnotic. Jar, bread, fish, dates, onions. Jar, bread, fish, dates, onions. Each ensemble was a clone of the next, a module of sustenance. The vessels were not fineware, they were sturdy, undecorated utility pottery, but their uniformity was striking. Each beer jar had the same slight bulge at the shoulder, each bread loaf the same diameter, each fish bundle the same number of reeds in its tie. This was not variety, but equity enforced through measurement. The atmosphere was one of profound, rigid anticipation. The hall was silent, but it was a charged silence, thick with imminence. The clean-swept floor showed the parallel strokes of the reed broom, lines curving around the base of each column. Not a stray straw, not a footprint marred its surface. The ordered arrays upon the mats seemed less like food and more like artifacts, components in a ritual that had not yet begun. The shadows of the columns lay long and motionless across them, as if pinning them in place. This space was the pivot point of the entire economic machine. Here, the abstract numbers impressed on the scribe's tablet, the counts of gur and ban, manifested as physical, divisible things. The hall translated accounting into apportionment. The geometric placement of the rations mirrored the geometric fields of the irrigated plain and the geometric bricks of the ziggurat. It was order all the way down, from the cosmos to the daily meal. From the far end of the hall, the perspective emphasized this order relentlessly. The rows of columns created a powerful visual recession, drawing the eye down a tunnel of alternating light and shadow toward a small, distant doorway filled with blinding sunlight. The repeating sets of rations on their mats formed a secondary rhythm within this framework, a beat of material certainty. The sheer length of the hall, the repetition, the cleanliness, all spoke of a system that was vast, impersonal, and inexorable. It was a machine made of space and protocol. The light shifted imperceptibly as the morning advanced. The rectangles of sunlight sliding across the floor slowly narrowed, their edges sharpening as the sun climbed higher. A beam would find a beer jar, setting its damp clay seal aglow, or strike a pile of dates, making them look like little lumps of gold. For a moment, that one ration would stand illuminated, vivid, before the light moved on, leaving it in shadow again and highlighting the next in line. This slow, celestial spotlight marched through the hall, indifferent to the contents it revealed, a silent parallel to the distributive process itself. There was no sound but the occasional, almost inaudible creak of a reed mat settling under the weight of its jar, or the faint, dry rustle of a date shifting in its bowl. The air remained cool, stored from the night, but at the edges of the sunbeams, one could see the heat shimmer, a promise of the day to come. The hall waited. It was a silent testament to the logic that governed every life in the city's shadow. From the god in the high temple came the fertility of the land. From the fertility came the grain. From the grain, the bread and beer, and here in this ordered silence, those products were portioned and laid out, an equation of survival made visible on a clean-swept floor. The redistribution hall was the calm, still center of the storm of labor. The point where the river of production pooled was measured into identical vessels and awaited its channeling into 1,000 anonymous homes. The city's heart beat not in its silent granaries, but in a dense, throbbing knot of noise. The marketplace was not a square, but a labyrinth, a tangle of narrow streets and irregular open spaces where the mud-brick walls of workshops and storerooms leaned inward, forming a canyon that trapped and amplified sound. Here, the ordered silence of the temple precinct dissolved into a physical, environmental roar, a crescendo of human industry that was the acoustic signature of early urban density. The sound was not a single noise, but a layered, seismic drone, a permanent atmospheric condition. At its foundation was a constant grinding hum, the sound of countless potters' wheels. These were simple stone discs set on wooden axles, spun by hand or foot. The wet clay, centered and yielding, met the steady pressure of the potter's fingers with a low, wet, rhythmic whir, whir, whir. This sound emanated from dark, open-fronted stalls, each contributing its own slightly off-tempo spin to the collective thrum, creating a pervasive, vibrating backdrop, the sonic equivalent of the silt-laden air. Over this bass, sharper, metallic rhythms hammered out a staccato counterpoint. From the coppersmith's quarter came the clang, glang, glang of stone hammers beating raw, glowing ingots into sheets. It was not a random cacophony, but a trained, repetitive strike, a heavy blow to spread the metal, followed by two lighter, quicker taps to smooth the surface. Different smiths worked at different paces, their hammers creating a complex, overlapping percussion that echoed off the hard brick walls. Interspersed was the fierce, breathy hiss of a crucible being tipped, the molten copper pouring into a mold with a sizzling sigh, and the subsequent gush of steam as the hot metal met damp sand. Weaving through this industrial orchestra were the human calls, not conversations, but ritualized announcements, projected from deep in the chest. They were melodic and formulaic, designed to pierce the din. A sesame oil vendor standing before rows of glistening jars would draw a long breath and intone, "Pure oil, pressed from white seeds." His voice rose on the last word, a clear, ringing note. From another alley came a guttural, rhythmic chant, "Reeds for mats." Strong reeds, each phrase punctuated by the slapping of a bundle of stalks on the ground. A baker's boy, balancing a platter of fresh loaves on his head, called out a simpler, higher-pitched bread, hot bread, in a short, repetitive loop as he wove through the crowd. These calls were not words so much as sonic landmarks, each vendor's cry a unique, recurring motif in the auditory tapestry. The sound did not travel freely. It was shaped and intensified by the city's very fabric. The walls of sun-dried mud brick were porous but solid, absorbing some frequencies and reflecting others. A sharp clang from a coppersmith would bounce from one wall to the opposite, creating a rapid, decaying echo that chased itself down the narrow street. The calls of merchants collided in the intersections, blending into a momentary babble before sorting themselves out as one moved past. The high, flat roofs of reed and mud acted as sounding boards, trapping the noise beneath them, compressing it into the crowded passages below. In the tightest alleys, the sound became a tangible pressure, a wall of vibration that pressed against the ears and the skin, felt in the chest as much as heard. The crowd itself generated a continuous low roar, the shuffle of countless leather sandals on packed earth, the rustle of linen and wool garments, the murmur of transactional exchanges too quiet to be distinct. This was the sound of bodies in proximity, a seismic rumble of movement and breath. It was punctuated by the sudden braying complaint of a donkey overloaded with pottery, or the sharp crack of a whip above a hauling sled's runners, cutting through the lower frequencies like a knife. There was no silence, only variations in density. Stepping into a slightly wider space, perhaps, where a small shrine created a pocket, the wall of sound would lessen for a few paces, becoming a roar from all directions rather than a crushing tunnel. Here, one could distinguish the individual threads, the precise tick-tick-tick of a lapidary drilling, a bead of carnelian with a bow drill, the wet, slapping sounds of a fishmonger cleaning his catch on a stone slab, the dry rustle of grain being poured from a sack into a measuring basket. The air in these streets was as thick with vibration as it was with the smells of dust, hot metal, animal dung, and frying oil. Sound was an environmental fact, as constant as the sun's heat. It was the product of thousands of simultaneous specialized actions, the shaping of clay, the working of metal, the trading of goods, all conducted in relentless, deafening proximity. This crescendo was the sound of the city feeding itself, clothing itself, equipping itself, independent of the temple's silent allocations. It was commerce as a natural force, a roaring, chaotic, and vital counterpart to the redistributive hall's serene order. The marketplace was a living organism, and its voice was a permanent, layered, physical roar, the definitive proof that humanity, once gathered in such density, could not be quiet. The noise was the city speaking its own name, over and over, in 1,000 grinding, clanging, calling tongues. Beyond the layered roar of the marketplace, in districts defined by a single, pervasive craft, the city's soundscape fractured into distinct, isolated environments. Here, the general cacophony receded, replaced by the precise, repetitive signatures of specialized labor. Each open-fronted workshop, its floor the bare earth of the street, functioned as an acoustic cell, contributing a unique and unwavering thread to the urban tapestry. Sound defined these spaces, giving them identity more clearly than any sign. In a narrow lane perpetually dusted with a fine gray powder, the dominant sound was a dry, rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape. It issued from a low stool where a flint knapper worked, a leather apron across his lap. Before him lay a core of glossy black obsidian, a volcanic glass fetched from distant mountains. In his hands was a softer tool, an antler tine, its tip worn smooth. The process was one of controlled fracture. The napper positioned the tine with exacting pressure against the obsidian's edge, then struck the tine's base with a rounded river cobble. A sharp talk of stone on antler preceded the clear, high ping of a flaw propagating through the glass, and then the longer, grating scrape as the resulting flake was lifted away and its edge refined with lighter, abrasive pressure. The sounds were clean, surgical, and cyclical. Talk, ping, scrape. Talk, ping, scrape. The debris at his feet, a growing pile of razor-sharp flakes and exhausted cores, was silent, but the air itself seemed etched by the sharp, percussive clarity of his work. Around a corner, the atmosphere changed, becoming metallic and volatile. This was the street of the metallurgists. The primary sound here was a deep, anxious hiss, like the breath of a giant beast. It emanated from a clay crucible nestled in a charcoal furnace, bellows driven to a searing heat. Within the crucible, malachite ore and charcoal flux underwent their transformation. The hiss was the sound of steam and gases escaping the molten brew, a constant breathy exhalation. Then came a fiercer, rushing sigh as a clay ladle dipped into the crucible's glowing mouth, emerging with a molten dollop of copper that shone with the blinding orange-white of the sun itself. This was poured into a waiting mold of baked sand, a shush-whoosh as the liquid metal flowed, followed by an aggressive spitting crackle as the damp sand superheated, releasing a plume of acrid steam that carried the sharp, electric scent of ozone and hot stone. The sequence was a cycle of tension and release. The building roar of the bellows, the sustained hiss, the sudden, violent rush of the pour, and then the fading sizzle as the metal solidified into a shape, an axe head, a chisel within its sandy womb. Further along, the sound grew dense and wet. Here the potters worked. The dominant noise was the slap-thump whir of clay being centered on the wheel. A lump of prepared clay, cool and heavy, was thrown onto the spinning stone disc with a wet, definitive slap. The potter's hands slick with water, then engaged, his palms applying opposing pressure with a solid thump to find the lump's true center. Once centered, the sound softened into the low, wet, continuous whir of the wheel itself, a sound like thick cloth tearing slowly as his fingers coaxed the rising wall of a vessel from the spinning mass. This sound was punctuated by the softer squelch of a sponge wiping excess slurry from his hands, or the faint tick-tick-tick of a wire tool, trimming the finished pot from the wheelhead. Unlike the knapper's sharp fractures or the metallurgist's violent transformations, the potter's sounds were fluid, organic, and cyclical, a sonic representation of the clay's plasticity, of form emerging from formlessness without breakage. Beneath these primary signatures lay secondary, supporting sounds that filled the interstitial silence. From a weaver's shaded alcove came the steady wooden clack-clack of the loom's heddles being shifted, followed by the soft thud of the batten pressing the new weft into place. From a woodworker's stall, the rasping drog-drog of a copper adze shaping a plank of imported cedar, and the sandy scratch of pumice smoothing the grain. From a lapidary's bench, the almost inaudible high-pitched zzz-zzz of a bow drill, its flint tip grinding into a bead of carnelian, a sound felt in the teeth more than heard by the ears. These sounds did not blend into a general din. They remained distinct, emanating from their specific sources like audible light from separate lamps. Walking down the lane was an exercise in acoustic segmentation. One passed through a zone of sharp, glassy percussion, then a zone of hissing, volatile heat, then a zone of wet, rotational thrumming. The transition between them was abrupt, a sudden change in the air's very frequency. The mud brick walls, while open at the front, contained and directed these sonic identities, preventing them from dissolving into the marketplace's generalized roar. The air in each zone carried its own tangible quality, shaped by the sound. The flint knapper's lane felt sharp and dry, the dust hanging still. The metallurgist's quarter felt charged and hot, the hisses and cracks seeming to vibrate in the heated air. The potter's street felt cool and damp, the whirring of the wheels creating a breeze of their own. Sound here was not merely a byproduct of labor, it was the environment itself. It defined the space of work, the pace of thought, the very texture of time, which passed not in hours but in counted cycles. So many flakes struck, so many crucibles poured, so many jars thrown. These workshops, with their unwavering sonic signatures, were the city's true organs. The knapper's scrape yielded the blades that harvested the grain and shaped the wood. The metallurgist's hiss yielded the tools that dredged the canals and the weapons that guarded the walls. The potter's whir yielded the vessels that stored the beer, water, and grain. Each precise, repetitive sound was a note in the city's hymn of self-sufficiency, a specialized utterance in the language of survival. In the craftsman's quarter, the abstract order of the temple met the physical necessity of the hand, and the meeting was announced not with a call or a song, but with the relentless, defining music of making. The sun's retreat was a slow leaching of color and dimension from the world. As the last copper glare bled from the western sky, the city beneath surrendered its details, dissolving into a uniform tapestry of grays and deep blues. But one form did not dissolve. It condensed. Against the fading violet of the twilight, the ziggurat became a black mass, a solid wedge of night carved from the descending dark. By day, the structure had been a mountain of textured brick, its slopes defined by sunlight and shadow. Now, it was a single, colossal silhouette. The stepped terraces merged into a single, sloping plain, their edges blurred. The long staircases that scored its flanks vanished into ink, becoming mere suggestions of deeper black within the black. The temple shrine at its peak, the cella, was no longer a distinct block but a slight, jagged thickening at the summit, a crown of darkness. The ziggurat lost all its daytime complexity. It was reduced to its essence, an immense geometric intrusion against the sky, heavier and more permanent than the sky itself. The city around it fell into a profound and gradual obscurity. The mud brick houses, the winding streets, the workshop stalls, all were swallowed by the gathering gloom, their forms melting into a single, low, undulating shadow at the mountain's base. No lamplight yet glimmered in the residential quarters. The people conserved their precious oil. The only points of light were the cold, distant sparks of early stars pricking through the velvet of the upper atmosphere, and the dull orange ember of the sun, now fully submerged below the world's rim. Then, on the highest terrace, a light was born. It was not one light, but several, the flickering, uncertain glow of oil lamps from within the cella. They were invisible as sources, but their illumination leaked from the shrine's doorway and from the narrow vents beneath its eaves. This light did not shine. It trembled. It was a living, breathing gold, pulsing gently against the absolute black of the ziggurat's bulk and the deep blue of the night sky. From the darkened city below, this was the only sign of human presence in the entire sacred complex, a tiny, luminous bead suspended at an impossible height. The psychological effect of this contrast was immense. The ziggurat, believed to be the literal dwelling place of the city's god, was now utterly inaccessible. By day, one could climb its stairs, approach its gates, even if only priests were permitted to enter. Its substance was knowable: sun-dried brick, straw binder, eroded plaster. By night, it transcended materiality. It became a pure manifestation of power and otherness. The black mass was silent, heavy, and watchful. The flickering light at its peak was a signal, but a signal without a decipherable code. It spoke of occupancy, of a presence awake in the house of the god while the city slept. It was a vigil no human eye witnessed, conducted for a divine audience alone. The silence around the structure was profound, but it was a different silence than that of the pre-dawn. That had been a silence of anticipation, cool and empty. This was a silence of aftermath, warm and full of the day's departed heat radiating from the bricks, full of the memory of noise now stilled. The air, still and cool, carried no scent but the dry mineral odor of cooled earth. No bird called from its niches. The wind, if it stirred, made no sound against the sheer monolithic faces. From the base of the ziggurat, looking up, the scale was vertiginous. The human mind struggled to reconcile the intimate, fragile dance of the lamplight with the monstrous, stable bulk that supported it. The light seemed both impossibly distant and unnervingly close, a star that had fallen and lodged itself in the crest of a man-made mountain. It emphasized the vertical hierarchy of the world, the darkened city of men, sleeping, blind, the black, mediating mass of the temple, silent, empty, and the solitary, illuminated cell of the god, awake, attended. The vast, sloping sides were a barrier, a ramp of darkness that separated the mundane from the divine more effectively than any wall of brick. The darkness was not uniform. As the eyes adjusted, subtle differentiations emerged within the black silhouette. The eastern face, still holding a memory of the vanished sun, was a slightly warmer black, a deep umber. The western face was a cooler, bluer black, the color of a deep well. The edges where the ziggurat met the sky were razor-sharp, a clean cutout against the slightly lighter firmament. The terrace walls, though invisible, could be sensed by the way the starlight ended abruptly, as if swallowed. And always the light above flickered. It would strengthen for a moment, perhaps as a priest trimmed a wick or added oil, throwing a brief, angular shadow from the cella's lintel out onto the empty terrace floor. Then it would subside, shrinking back into a soft, pulsing ember. This rhythm was hypnotic and utterly lonely. It was a heartbeat in the stone, a sign of life in a realm that was, by definition, beyond life. For the few awake in the city to see it, a guard on a wall, a restless child on a roof, it was a comfort and a mystery. It meant the god was at home, the covenant was maintained, the order of the world was intact, but it also underscored their own exclusion, their own earth-bound reality in the shadow below. The ziggurat, after sundown, was no longer an architectural fact. It was a psychological entity. Its darkness was active, a presence that pushed against the twilight. Its single point of light was a focal point for awe and anxiety. It was the axis of the world, now invisible but felt more strongly than ever, a black spindle around which the night, the city, and the heavens themselves seemed to turn. The cool air, the silent bulk, the trembling beacon together, they created an atmosphere of profound and humble scale. Humanity had piled earth to the sky to invite the divine down, and in the darkness the invitation alone remained visible, a tiny, persistent flame in a vast, silent house of mud brick, holding the line against the total night. Full dark was an unveiling. As the last memory of sunset drained from the west, and the solitary lamp on the ziggurat's peak was shuttered for the deepest watch of the night, the human world ceased to be a thing of sight. The city vanished, swallowed by a blackness so complete it felt like a weight on the eyes. In its absence, the true ceiling of the world revealed itself with a brilliance that was almost violent. The Milky Way was not a misty band, but a frozen, jagged cataract of light. It split the heavens from the northern to the southern horizon, a river of crushed diamonds and cold silver dust, so dense in its core that it cast faint, perceptible shadows on the pale earth of the rooftops. It was not a backdrop for the stars, but a solid presence among them, a luminous geography with depth and texture, dark rifts like river channels cutting through its luminous plains. This was the celestial Tigris, a flood of light perpetually flowing through the vault of the god Anu. Around this central torrent, the constellations were not polite patterns, but fierce, bright clusters that dominated their quarters of the sky. The lion of Urgula reared with a clarity that etched its shape into the mind. Each star of its sickle-blade mane burned with a steady, icy fire. The scorpion of Gurtab was a sprawling, aggressive arc of red and white sparks, its tail a hooked sting poised to strike the southern horizon. These were not imaginings, but facts, as real and present as the mud-brick walls below, their ancient light traveling unimpeded through the perfect, empty medium of the unpolluted night. The sky was not a dome, but a deep, inverted bowl of black crystal, its inner surface studded with a million piercing points, each a distant, silent sun. The familiar became alien, immense and overwhelmingly close. Within the sealed interior of a reed house, this celestial dominion asserted itself through a single, slow-moving agent. Through the high, small opening in the wall, a shaft of moonlight found its way. It was not the yellow light of a lamp, but a cold blue-silver radiance, pure and directionless. As the moon climbed its arc, this beam moved with glacial patience across the room. It touched the woven sleeping mat, transforming the pattern of reeds into a grid of sharp black lines and glowing ivory. It found the ceramic grain jar, tracing a perfect, luminous circle on its curved shoulder, making the rough pottery look like polished alabaster for a few minutes before moving on. It illuminated the cold hearth, turning the gray ash into a bed of crushed pearls, each particle glittering before being abandoned again to uniform dark. The beam was a silent visitor, highlighting one anonymous object after another, granting each a moment of stark, beautiful clarity before consigning it back to the common darkness. It asked no questions, told no stories. It was simply the moon passing by. In its light, the domestic tools, the spindle, the grinding stone, the water jar, looked like ritual objects, their functional forms elevated to geometry. Then the light would pass, and they would disappear, absorbed back into the warm, formless dark of the room. This cycle of revelation and concealment was the night's only clock. Outside, the silence was total and profound. The residential quarters were not merely quiet, they were acoustically dead. The dense mud brick and reed walls absorbed sound, creating a vacuum. The cacophony of the day, the market's roar, the craftsman's percussion, the calls and shuffles might never have existed. This silence had weight and texture. It was a thick, velvety absence that filled the narrow streets and sealed courtyards, pressing against the ears. Into this absolute stillness, any sound was an event, magnified and stripped of context. From the distant fringe where the city met the irrigated plain, The bark of a dog echoed sharp and lonely. It was not a frantic sound, but a single declarative statement thrown at the stars, answered only by itself. The wind, when it rose, did not whistle. It was a low, dry sigh that moved through the alleys, lifting minute particles of dust and carrying the scent of the cooling canal mud from the fields, a scent of damp minerals and distant sleeping water. It was the sound of the plain itself, exhaling. Occasionally, the taut linen of a roof covering would snap softly as the temperature dropped, a sound like a muted drumbeat. These isolated noises did not break the silence. They defined its edges, proving its depth. The human-made environment had receded. The canals were invisible threads of blackness. The ziggurat was a deeper patch of starless void. The houses were mere mounds of warm earth. All the day's grand projects of order and control, the geometry of the fields, the hierarchy of the temple, the inventory of the granary, were rendered null, invisible, and small. They were temporary arrangements upon a crust of silt under an immortal sky. In their place, the cosmos dominated. This was not a passive backdrop, but an active sensory immersion. The sky was seen, not glanced at. Its brilliance was a physical pressure, a cool light that fell on upturned faces, not as illumination, but as a presence. The silence was heard, a ringing in the ears that was the sound of one's own blood in the absence of all else. This was the time when the world belonged again to the gods whose names were written in those star fields. The great ziggurat, now dark, was merely a failed attempt to bridge the gap, its summit lost in the overwhelming starry vastness it was built to reach. The night was a daily restoration of primal scale. It reduced the city to what it was, a fragile, recent accumulation on an ancient plain. It magnified the heavens to what they always were, the eternal, inhabited home of powers that dictated the river's flood, the grain's growth, and the fate of all things made of mud and reed. Under this sky without flame, humanity was a sleeping audience to its own insignificance and wonder, wrapped in a silence so deep it felt like the listening ear of the cosmos itself, waiting for a dawn that was not a human invention, but a celestial concession. That, my dear listeners, is farewell for now, until we meet again in a different time.